Anyhow, it's good to be here with you. I'm gonna jump right in. I'm really grateful to have you before me, and yet I'm also aware of the fact that as a professor, I'm terrible at managing time. I give notoriously long introductions. And so I'm going to try to jump right in, because the other piece is I would love to get out of the way to welcome the panel, which I'll do in a minute. And so I'm going to offer, hopefully, what will be just like 15 minutes of what was initially personal testimony and reflection, but what kind of turned into like book recommendations and professorial slides. So I'm sorry, but there's going to be some reflection as well. But I think I'm just broken. I've been teaching too long. Like the only thing that comes out is like PowerPoint slides and whatnot. So with that said, though, I do want to maybe frame this as saying, in talking about the gifts of the Black church, the whole church, I'm kind of a strange person to maybe be introducing this topic. I come to Black Christianity as an outsider, obviously. But I want to share my humble offerings, my humble perspectives on gifts that Black Christianity has offered to me as someone who, though I'm not Black, as a person of color, identify with a lot of the traditions in Black Christianity. And in a second, I will happily get out of the way for a wonderful panel, an intergenerational panel of Black clergy and Black Christian leaders from our community, and we will let them really take center stage on this. And so a few brief thoughts, and then we'll jump right in. Before we go to the next slide, I actually want to offer what may seem like a strange place to begin. But in 2016, Macklemore released an album that some of you may be familiar with. This is maybe a strange place to start, but stick with me. You'll see where we're going. These are a couple of just short lyrics from one song on the album called White Privilege 2. And some of you, if you don't know who Macklemore is, he's a white rapper from Seattle. His name is Ben Haggerty. And he wrote this song as, I think, a little bit of a reflection on being white in an industry where white folks are not represented very, for good reason, historically. And but also, it's also his reflection on just what it means to be white in the context of hip-hop. And I want to offer you these two lyrics, and then we'll kind of jump in and look at some other lyrics in a second. So it's from the song, it's at the end of the song, and he says, "We want to dress like, walk like, talk like, dance like, yet we just stand by. We take all we want from Black culture, but will we show up for Black lives?" And that repeats a little bit in the song. Again, he says, "We want to dress like, walk like, talk like, dance like, yet we just stand by. We take all we want from Black culture, but will we show up for Black lives?" I'll explain maybe why I thought of that song in a second, but I also want to explain maybe the title here, and so we'll come back. Trouble I've Seen, I'm borrowing this from a mid-1800s Black spiritual that some of you may know. The lyrics from this song, 150 years earlier than Macklemore. The beginning, I'm not going to read all of the lyrics for Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, but if you've heard this before, you might know some of this language. It begins, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen, nobody knows my sorrow. Sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down, sometimes I'm almost to the ground. Nobody knows but Jesus." I included this as a way to start, if I get the next slide, because when I think about the gifts of the Black church to the whole church, it's something that's been ongoing from its very beginning. The first person I thought of was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Again, maybe a strange place to begin, but if you know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, you might know that as he is kind of coming to prominence in Germany in the build-up to World War II, and as Hitler's regime and Nazi Germany is kind of rising, Bonhoeffer is in this place of trying to understand what it means to be a confessing Christian in the wake of a country that's basically going along with Hitler's agenda. And in the midst of this, he decides to come to New York City, and he lands at Union Theological Seminary for a time to study in Harlem. And while he's there in Harlem, a classmate of his introduces him to a place called Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. And Bonhoeffer, being a German theologian, trained and intellectual and very capable, is really, really taken with the Black church that he encounters at Abyssinian Baptist. And as he is there, he becomes marked by these black spirituals. And he, for the rest of his life, even after he would return to Germany, would bring records of black spirituals like this one, like Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And he would bring it back. And actually, these would be the songs that he would sing with his underground seminarians at Finkenwald. For some of you who know the book Life Together and so forth. But this is a little bit of a short reflection of his in the early 1930s as he's trying to put together the relationship between the white church and the black church. And this is what he says, even as he's being deeply shaped by these black spirituals. He says that every white American knows, sings, and loves these songs. It is barely understandable that great black singers can sing these songs before packed concert audiences of whites to tumultuous applause, while at the same time these men and women are still denied access to the white community through social discrimination. Nowhere is revival preaching still so vigorous and widespread as among blacks, that here the gospel of Jesus Christ is preached and accepted with great welcome. And so for Bonhoeffer, I'll bring it back to Macklemore for a second. I think he's asking us a similar question. There's a bit of a disconnect he experiences. He says, it's clear to me that the Spirit of God is vibrant and at work in the black church, and these white audiences seem to enjoy it and applaud, and they know and love these songs, and yet when it comes to the very structures of society, there's a little bit of a disconnect. And I think Macklemore is asking us a similar question. Like, when it really counts for us to show up and to understand these traditions, I feel like there's a bit of some hesitancy often among churches like ours of maybe keeping this at arm's length. And so I want to just introduce this as a way of saying that these gifts of the black church to all of us are not something to just be consumed at arm's length, that we find it inspiring, but instead it costs us something. And so I want to just quickly transition to these gifts because I'm using up more time than I want to. So these three gifts from the black church, really quickly, they are something that will move to inspire us, and yet I hope they'll also challenge us to go a little bit deeper, to ask us that question of, will we really show up when it counts? So these three gifts: an integrated faith, a whole life faith, a courageous faith that is spirit empowered, and an enduring faith, a faith that perseveres through struggle. And so these three gifts are things that I think we'll talk about in some ways in the panel that's to come. I want to offer you a few brief perspectives from folks. This is in no way comprehensive, but these are gifts that have been formative in my life as I think about the testimony of black Christianity for us all. And so the first one, Lisa Sharon Harper, you may know her work through Sojourners, a large national organization, as an organizer, as a pastor. There's going to be a few book plugs along here. I'm not going to talk about the books, but if you're the reading type, you want to write them down, feel free. I love the framing that she offers in this book, which is her most recent text called The Very Good Gospel. And in the beginning of the book, basically what she says is she wonders if the gospel that she received was good enough to overcome all the injustices in society. And she reflects on visiting the King Center in Atlanta and walking away from it, wondering if the gospel that she understood was big enough and good enough and deep enough to counter the deep brokenness that she saw in so much of American history. And just a brief perspective on what I mean by an integrated faith or a whole life faith. This, for me, was eye-opening because I grew up in a Christian tradition that really emphasized spirituality in a very narrow way. That most of what my Christian faith had to do with my life was could be summed up in this idea of like a Christian lifestyle, like that my narrow personal spirituality was really the main goal of what it meant to be a Christian. And I think one of the gifts of black Christianity to the whole church is to say, from its beginning, black Christianity always had to encompass all of life, not just my particular personal religious habits or how I viewed my spirituality or my lifestyle, but from its inception, the black church always had to ask bigger questions about a bigger gospel because everything was always at stake. And so questions of socioeconomics and politics, of the public good, of housing and education, all of those things landed front and center for the black church because they were fully integrated. And so when I talk about a whole life faith, for some of you, you're like, yeah, that's the Christianity I grew up in. And for others of you, it's a newer conversation, right? And I think it's a gift that the church offers to say, there are some of us, for whom this is not a new conversation. And every time I think there's a Christian or an evangelical conference around justice, I kind of look around at my friends and colleagues of color who come from communities that have had brought a more integrated faith, and there's a little bit of some eye rolling and some arms folded saying it's good that people have come along to join this conversation, and yet others of us have been in the work for a long time, and so how can we have that conversation together and receive that gift together? I'm going to keep going. The second gift is not just an integrated faith, but a courageous faith. And I wish I had more time to talk about Perkins, although I think he'll come up a little bit later as well. There's two moments in John Perkins' life that really stand out to me, and whenever I wonder about what it means to be a Christian in the world, I think about these two moments in John Perkins' life because I still wrestle with what they mean for the church as a whole and for myself. The first one is basically you have to understand a bit of his backstory. I think many of you are maybe familiar with a bit of Perkins' life. Born into grinding poverty in Mississippi as a sharecropper's son, experiences enormous amount of trauma young in life, right? His mother dies essentially of starvation and poverty. His father leaves when he's young. His older brother is shot down by police in an act of violence that was unjustified. And he escapes from Mississippi. And he actually migrates out to Pasadena in sunny Southern California. He's one of the few folks who made it out, right? He escapes from that life. He gets married. He starts a career. He has a successful business. And more or less, Perkins, he makes it, right? He makes it out from a scenario that many black men like him would not have survived and did not survive. And sometimes I think about how in Perkins' life he could have just stayed there in California and done his ministry there, and we would have all applauded him and said, "Thank you, John Perkins, for your wonderful testimony. You're one of the folks who made it out." But in 1960, he becomes a Christian, and interestingly, he decides to go back to Mississippi. And I don't want you to miss the significance of that decision. If you're a black man in 1960 who escaped from poverty and violence in Mississippi, why in the world would you go back to the scene of the crime? Why would you go back to all of the trauma, to all of the dysfunction, to all the brokenness out of which you had escaped? And the only reason I can think of, and I think the way Perkins would narrate it, is to say that he felt a call. He felt the Spirit of God calling him back to this place, even though he knew what would be waiting for him there. Interestingly, it's not unlike Dietrich Bonhoeffer's call back to Germany in 1940 at the peak of Hitler's power to say, if I want to participate in the reconstruction of this society, how can I do that if I don't join my people and suffer with them in that reconstruction? And so Perkins, in that moment, that's the first moment where I think, I know that I read the same Bible as John Perkins. I know that I pray to the same Jesus as John Perkins. I'm not sure I would come to that same conclusion. I think if I was in Southern California, I would say, I'm good. I think I'll stay here. I'm not really interested in going back to Mississippi, but he goes. And so the second moment in Perkins' life where I think that really encapsulates his courage is he goes back knowing what is waiting for him. And sure enough, a few years later, he goes to basically bail out some college students who he had been working with, doing some organizing work. They end up in jail. He gets called to come and bail them out. But of course, it's a trap. It's an ambush. The police there, the local sheriff, as Perkins goes to get these college students he had been working with out of jail, he gets arrested. But not just arrested, he gets brutally assaulted and nearly killed. And so this little excerpt, which I'm not going to read the whole thing, comes from his reflection on this encounter of being assaulted in jail and nearly beaten to death. In fact, most of the witnesses, he was unconscious during much of the beating. Students who were there witnessing said they were sure he was dead, that he was not going to make it. And he himself, in his reflection, says he didn't think he was going to make it out alive. And yet, he has this moment that he kind of describes here a bit, where he says, as he prayed on the floor of the jail, wondering what had happened to these men who were beating him down so viciously, he said to God, if you will let me get out of this jail, I really want to preach a gospel that will heal these people too. And again, I think this story has been told a lot, but I don't want us to miss the great courage that Perkins' testimony calls us to. It's the same thing. It really asks us to dig deep, to find and to gather what King calls the strength to love. Is it possible that in the face of such violence and hatred, we can not return violence, but instead can find something beyond ourselves. The courage not to return violence with violence, but instead to say, I wonder what has happened to these men, that hate has so twisted and distorted them. And how can that be a gift to each of us to wonder, as I think about the very, very small courage in my Christian faith, I'm really inspired by Perkins to dig a little bit deeper and to go further. The last gift is an enduring faith. And Fannie Lou Hamer, who is there on the upper right, this is my favorite quote of hers because I think it sums up her fatigue and her determination through the civil rights movement. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. According to history, President Lyndon Johnson was not afraid of King's testimony, but was afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer, who, like John Perkins, was from Mississippi, was born into sharecropping, had suffered so much violence and discrimination in her life. And in 1964, this pivotal moment in civil rights history, she testifies before the Democratic National Convention about her experience of going down to register to vote. And she describes in painstaking detail the intimidation and the violence that she would suffer for trying to register to vote. The 15th Amendment, which nearly 100 years later had affirmed voting rights for all. And yet she, in detail here, basically just explains all the hostility that she encountered. And this becomes, for many, what is a turning point in the movement. But it's not just her determination. She's sometimes known as the singing activist. There's a deep spirituality that she draws on to endure in this work. And as much as I'm inspired by her perseverance, one other thing I want to think about, if we could go back to the last slide. One thing that you have to grasp when it comes to the civil rights movement is how much progress we have made and also how little change there has been in the last 50 to 60 years. And this is something that I think really demands us to persevere now. So much of what Perkins and King and all of the other folks, the chorus of individuals of which Hamer is one, so much of what they fought for, we are grateful for, the legislation that has passed, and yet if you look at the research, if you look at housing, if you look at education, if you look at employment and healthcare and all of these metrics today, I think we have to be honest to say there hasn't been a lot of change in a lot of ways for the Black community in those past 50 to 60 years. And I think that forces us to ask the question of what perseverance will look like for those of us in this generation as well. This isn't, we just finished Black History Month, and I have to spend so much time with students saying it wasn't done after the laws were passed, but in fact, there's much, much more work for us to do. And so I'm really grateful for people like Reverend Barber, William Barber down there on the right. He is leading what's called the New Poor People's Campaign. The Poor People's Campaign was what King had gathered together to march on Washington in 1968. And what they're basically saying as they resurrect this movement is that much more spiritual fervor and political action is needed for us to move forward in this work. And I love the language of this New Poor People's Campaign. What Barber is calling for is basically a national moral revival. And he, as a preacher and a pastor from the Black church, is inviting us to consider taking up that work again. How can we endure now as we think about the ongoing legacy, the unfinished business of the civil rights movement in the church? So I want to leave it here as we transition to the panel in just a minute and really just invite you to process these gifts. What would it take for the church to think about receiving, the whole church to receive these gifts of an integrated faith, the breadth of a faith that encompasses all of life, a courageous faith that stands up to injustice and that speaks truth to power and that stands in harm's way, even in the face of evil, and an enduring faith, one that through these great struggles is continuing to ask these questions today. And so on that note, as we think about what that requires of us to show up and to really engage, I'm going to invite the panelists to come on up so I can get out of the way. And I'm going to have them all just come on up. There's some seats here. And so I'm going to introduce them in a moment. But why don't you, as they come on up, can we offer them some welcome? And I'll introduce them in a second. Yeah.